March 15, 2024. Father Michael Torino had been running from the truth for 14 years. Tonight, at 7:43 p.m., the truth kicked down the doors of St. Catherine's Academy. 4 masked men with assault rifles. 37 parents trapped in the gymnasium. Michael stood in the hallway, rosary in his trembling hands, watching his past walk through metal detectors that screamed like banshees. "We want justice for Amir Hassan," the lead gunman announced. Every parent in that room turned to stare at Michael. They didn't know the name, but Michael did. The boy who died in his rectory. The boy whose death he'd helped cover up. The boy whose father had promised vengeance before disappearing into the Detroit underground. What happened in the next 4 hours would expose secrets buried deeper than bodies. The FBI would call it the most complex hostage situation in Michigan history. And Michael would finally understand that some sins don't stay buried. They just wait for the perfect moment to resurrect themselves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gymnasium fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Michael's legs felt like water, but he forced himself to step forward, his black collar tight against his throat. "Father Torino." The lead gunman's voice carried a slight accent, Middle Eastern but softened by years in Detroit. "Come closer." Michael's 15 years as principal had prepared him for many crises: budget cuts, angry parents, the occasional student breakdown. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, when his carefully constructed world would crumble like ancient parchment. "Please," Michael said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Let the families go. This is between us." A bitter laugh echoed from behind the black ski mask. "Between us? No, Father. This involves everyone who was complicit in the cover-up. Everyone who chose silence over justice." Michael's mind raced back to that October night in 2009. Rain against the rectory windows. Amir Hassan, 19 years old, lying on the Persian rug that Michael's mother had given him, blood pooling beneath the boy's head, and Father Morrison, already reaching for his phone to call someone other than 911. "I don't know what you think you know," Michael began. But the gunman cut him off. Amir Hassan, 19 years old, engineering student at Wayne State. He came to St. Michael's Parish that night because someone had called him, told him Father Morrison wanted to discuss the community outreach program. The gunman's voice grew harder with each word. He never made it home. Parents huddled together on the gymnasium bleachers, clutching their children. Michael recognized the Kowalskis, the O'Briens, the Martinez family. Good Catholic families who trusted him with their children's futures. None of them knew about the secrets buried in his past. "The official story," the gunman continued, beginning to pace, "was that Amir Hassan died in a car accident on 8 Mile Road. Tragic. Random. Case closed." He stopped directly in front of Michael. "But we both know that's not what happened." Michael's rosary cut into his palm as he gripped it tighter. 14 years of sleepless nights, of seeing Amir's face in every young man who walked through his school's doors. 14 years of telling himself that what they'd done was necessary, that the truth would have destroyed more lives than it saved. "I want to speak with whoever's in charge," Michael said. "This isn't the place for—" "This is exactly the place." The gunman gestured toward the parents and children. "These people trust you. They believe in you. They think you're a man of God." A pause. "They deserve to know who you really are." One of the other gunmen whispered something urgent in Arabic. The lead gunman nodded and turned back to Michael. "The police are setting up a perimeter. Good. Let them come. Let them all witness what happens when the truth finally comes to light." Michael's throat felt like sandpaper. "What do you want?" "Justice. Confession. The names of everyone involved in the cover-up." The gunman reached into his jacket, and several parents gasped, but he only pulled out a manila envelope. "Everything is in here, Father. Police reports that were buried, witness statements that disappeared, financial records showing payments made to keep certain mouths shut." The envelope hit the gymnasium floor between them like a gauntlet. "Amir was my brother." The words hung in the air like incense. Michael stared at the masked face, trying to see past the fabric to the eyes beneath. Amir had mentioned a younger brother, Malik. He would be in his 30s now. The police told us he died instantly in the crash, Malik continued. But the autopsy photos tell a different story. Head trauma consistent with a blunt force weapon, defensive wounds on his hands, blood under his fingernails. His voice cracked slightly. My brother fought for his life, and you let them throw him away like garbage. Michael felt the weight of 37 families watching him, waiting for his response. These were people who had entrusted their children to his care, who believed in the moral authority of his position. In 3 minutes, everything they believed about him would be destroyed. Please, Michael whispered. Not here. Not in front of the children. Where then, Father? In another back room? Another place where inconvenient truths can be buried? Malik raised his voice so everyone could hear. How many other secrets are you hiding? The sirens were getting closer. Red and blue lights flashed through the gymnasium windows, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. Michael realized this was the moment he'd been dreading for 14 years, the reckoning he'd prayed would never come. But as he looked into Malik Hassan's eyes through the ski mask, he saw something that chilled him more than anger or hatred. He saw certainty, the absolute conviction of someone who believes they're on a righteous mission. And that, Michael knew from experience, was the most dangerous thing of all. The first SWAT vehicle pulled into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the building like searchlights hunting for escaped prisoners. Time was running out for everyone. The headlights carved harsh geometric shadows across the gymnasium walls, and in that stark illumination, Michael saw faces he'd known for years, transformed by terror and confusion. Sarah Martinez clutched her twin daughters, both 6th graders who helped him tend the school's memorial garden every Friday after classes. The O'Brien boy, Timothy, 8th grade altar server at Sunday Mass, pressed against his father's side, his face pale as communion wafer. These weren't just families, they were his family, in the way that only 15 years of shared milestones could create. He'd baptized half these children, celebrated their first communions, watched them grow from gap-toothed kindergartners into young adults ready for high school. The Kowalski girl had been in his office just last week, crying about her parents' divorce, trusting him with her deepest fears. Now they would all learn what kind of man they'd been trusting. Michael's fingers found the worn edges of his rosary beads, each one a prayer he'd whispered during countless sleepless nights. Hail Mary, full of grace. But grace felt very far away as the police sirens grew louder, as Malik Hassan's breathing grew more agitated behind his mask, as 37 families waited for answers Michael wasn't sure he could give. The manila envelope lay between them like original sin, heavy with consequence, impossible to ignore. Michael knew what was inside without looking. He'd seen those same documents in his nightmares for 14 years, the real autopsy report. The witness statement from Mrs. Chen, who lived across from the rectory and saw Amir Hassan arrive that night, but never saw him leave. The bank records showing the sudden influx of diocesan funds that had renovated St. Catherine's Gymnasium 3 months after Amir's death. Blood money. That's what his sister Elena had called it during their last phone conversation 5 years ago, before she'd stopped speaking to him entirely. You can't build a school on a boy's grave, Michael. It doesn't work that way. But he had built this school, brick by brick, student by student, creating something beautiful from something broken. These children were proof that good could emerge from darkness, weren't they? Timothy O'Brien, who'd struggled with dyslexia until Michael had found him the right tutor. The Martinez twins, whose father had been unemployed until Michael had connected him with a parishioner who needed an electrician. Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, who'd received a full scholarship to Catholic Central because Michael had written her recommendation letter himself. You're thinking about them, Malik said, following Michael's gaze to the huddled families. Good. You should. They're going to hate you in about 10 minutes. Michael's mouth tasted of copper and regret. They don't deserve this. Neither did Amir. Malik's voice carried the weight of 14 years of grief. He was going to be an engineer. Did you know that? He wanted to design bridges. He said bridges brought people together, connected things that were meant to be separate. A bitter laugh. Instead, he became a secret that divided our family for years. The gymnasium's heating system clicked on with a mechanical wheeze, pushing warm air through vents that needed cleaning. Michael noticed everything now: the scuff marks on the polished floor from last week's basketball game, the faint smell of industrial disinfectant that couldn't quite mask the lingering odor of teenage sweat and cafeteria pizza, the way little Emma Kowalski kept looking toward the exit doors like a trapped bird. This was his sanctuary, his life's work. Every morning for 15 years he'd walked these halls knowing he was protecting something precious. Not just a building, but a community, a place where children could grow up safe and loved and certain of their worth in God's eyes. But sanctuaries built on lies had a way of crumbling. "The police will want to negotiate," Michael said quietly. "They'll send someone in to talk, someone trained for this. Let them come." Malik's companions shifted nervously, automatic weapons catching the stark light from outside. They can listen too. The whole world can listen. 14 years of silence is enough. Through the windows, Michael could see more vehicles arriving. News vans with satellite dishes, more police cars. Soon this gymnasium would be the center of a media storm that would destroy not just his reputation, but the carefully constructed peace these families had built their lives around. Mrs. Chen's granddaughter Sarah was in the crowd somewhere. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there because tonight was report card distribution. She would hear her grandfather's story told as evidence of conspiracy and cover-up. She would learn that the man who'd helped her get into high school was the same man who'd helped bury the truth about her family's grief. The red and blue lights continued their silent rotation, painting everything in alternating colors of emergency and damnation. Michael closed his eyes and felt 14 years of careful construction beginning to collapse around him. Time was running out for confession. But perhaps, Michael thought with something that might have been relief, that was exactly what he deserved. His moment of resignation shattered when one of the younger gunmen approached Malik with urgent whispers. The Arabic was too fast for Michael to follow, but he caught two words that made his blood freeze: Morrison and here. "What?" Malik's voice cut through the whispered conversation like a blade. The younger man gestured toward the entrance doors, his weapon trembling slightly in his grip. More urgent Arabic, then a single English phrase: "He just arrived." Michael felt the world tilt sideways. Father Morrison had retired to a small parish in Arizona 4 years ago, citing health concerns and a need for desert solitude. Michael had attended his farewell dinner, had even driven him to Detroit Metro for his flight west. They'd exchanged Christmas cards, brief, careful notes that never mentioned October 2009. Morrison couldn't be here. Morrison was safely contained 3 states away, his silence purchased with distance, and the diocesan pension that had mysteriously increased after his transfer. But through the gymnasium's entrance windows, Michael caught sight of a familiar silhouette in the parking lot's harsh illumination. Tall, slightly stooped, wearing the black wool coat Michael remembered from countless winter evenings. Father Gerald Morrison, 68 years old, walking toward the building with the measured pace of a man approaching his own execution. "No," Michael whispered. Then louder, "No, he can't." "Oh, but he can." Malik's voice carried a satisfaction that made Michael's skin crawl. "Did you think we hadn't planned for this? Did you think we didn't know about the phone call he made 4 hours ago?" Michael's legs nearly buckled. A phone call. Morrison had called someone, had learned about the hostage situation and flown back to Detroit. But why? After 4 years of careful silence, why risk everything now? The answer hit Michael like physical force. Morrison was coming to confess. "The old priest has a conscience, it seems," Malik continued, watching Michael's face crumble. "Unlike some people, he can't sleep while children are in danger because of his sins." Through the windows, Michael watched Morrison approach the police perimeter. Even from this distance, he could see the Mila envelope clutched in the old priest's weathered hands, the same kind of envelope that lay between Michael and Malik on the gymnasium floor. "He kept copies," Michael breathed. "Insurance," Malik confirmed. "Your friend Morrison is many things, but he's not stupid. He knew this day would come eventually." A pause. "What he didn't know was that we've been watching both of you for years." The words hit Michael like ice water. Years. Not just tonight, not just this carefully orchestrated confrontation. They'd been under surveillance, their movements tracked, their secrets cataloged with the patience of true believers. "How long?" Michael asked. though he dreaded the answer. Since 2015, when my brother's case was officially closed and the Detroit PD destroyed what they claimed were the last remaining files. Malik's voice carried the weight of systematic planning. Did you really think Amir's death would stay buried forever? That the truth dies with paperwork? Morrison had reached the police line now. Michael watched in horror as the old priest handed his envelope to someone in tactical gear. A detective, maybe, or a federal agent. The contents would be photographed, analyzed, cross-referenced with whatever evidence Malik had compiled. There would be no more room for denial. The Martinez twins, Malik said suddenly, following Michael's desperate gaze toward the huddled families. Their father works for Kowalski Construction, doesn't he? The same company that did the emergency rectory renovation in November 2009? Michael's breath caught. Even that. They knew about the rushed repairs to remove bloodstains from 100-year-old hardwood floors, the new Persian rug that had replaced his mother's gift, the fresh paint that had covered what Morrison claimed were scuff marks but Michael knew were arterial spray patterns. Carlos Martinez pulled the old flooring himself, Malik continued relentlessly. He found something interesting underneath, something that made him ask uncomfortable questions. Questions that were answered with a sudden promotion and a company truck he still drives today. Across the gymnasium, Carlos Martinez seemed to sense their attention. His weathered face went pale as understanding dawned, not just about what was happening tonight, but about why his life had taken such a fortunate turn 14 years ago. Morrison was inside the building now. Michael could hear voices in the hallway, footsteps approaching the gymnasium. The police would want to establish communication to begin whatever negotiation protocols they'd been trained for. But Morrison would tell them the truth first, would hand over his insurance policy and watch 14 years of careful lies collapse in minutes. Michael realized with crystalline clarity that his old life was ending, not in some abstract future moment, but right now. With each step Morrison took down the familiar hallway. The man who'd helped him bury Amir Hassan was coming to resurrect the truth, and 37 families were about to learn exactly what kind of sanctuary they'd been worshiping in. The gymnasium doors opened with a metallic click that sounded like judgment itself. Father Morrison stepped through the gymnasium doors like a ghost materializing from Michael's deepest nightmares. The old priest moved slowly, deliberately, his black coat still dusted with what looked like Arizona sand. His face carried 4 years of desert penance, carved deeper by the harsh fluorescent lights and the weight of the manila envelope he'd already surrendered to the authorities. Gerald Michael's voice cracked like a teenage altar boy's. He felt every eye in the gymnasium turn toward them. Parents who'd known both priests from parish gatherings, children who'd received communion from Morrison's weathered hands during his farewell mass 4 years ago. Morrison's pale blue eyes swept the hostages before settling on Malik. No surprise there. No confusion about why armed men had taken over a Catholic school gymnasium. Morrison had known this day would come, had been expecting it. Father Hassan, Morrison said quietly, using Malik's father's title. I received word about tonight's gathering. The formal politeness of it sent ice through Michael's veins. Morrison wasn't here to negotiate or diffuse the situation. He was here to complete something he'd started with that phone call, that envelope, that long flight from Phoenix to Detroit carrying the weight of confession. You came, Malik replied, and Michael caught something unexpected in his voice. Relief. As if Morrison's presence validated everything, transformed this from terrorism into something approaching justice. I should have come years ago. Morrison's voice carried across the silent gymnasium with the authority of decades in the pulpit. Should have spoken when it mattered instead of hiding in the desert like some hermit saint. Michael watched his carefully constructed world crack like ice on the Detroit River. The families were listening now, really listening, picking up the undercurrent of shared history between Morrison and their masked captors. Sarah Martinez's mother had started crying, quiet tears of someone realizing they'd been lied to for years. Don't do this, Michael whispered. Not here, not with children present. Morrison's laugh held no humor. Amir Hassan was someone's child too. He turned toward the hostages, and Michael saw the decision crystallize on his weathered features. These people have a right to know what kind of men they've trusted with their children's souls. Gerald, please. No. Morrison's voice cut through Michael's plea with surgical precision. 14 years of pleas. 14 years of we had no choice. 14 years of watching you build this school like some monument to your own redemption while that boy's family grieved a lie. The younger gunmen had raised their weapons slightly, confused by this development. They'd planned for resistance, for denial, for the usual hostage dynamics. They hadn't planned for voluntary confession from the conspirators themselves. But Malik lowered his rifle, watching Morrison with something that might have been respect. "Tell them," he said simply. Morrison nodded and turned to face the families. Michael wanted to run, to disappear through the floor like smoke, but his legs wouldn't move. He could only stand there and watch his mentor, the man who'd ordained him, guided him, helped him cover up murder, prepare to destroy them both. October 15th, 2009, Morrison began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of Sunday sermons. A young Muslim man named Amir Hassan came to St. Michael's Rectory to discuss interfaith outreach programs. Someone gasped. Michael thought it might have been Mrs. Chen, whose late husband had been asking questions about that night for months before his convenient heart attack in 2011. Questions that had stopped after Chen's sudden windfall from diocesan charity funds. He never left that building alive, Morrison continued, each word falling like stones into still water. And instead of calling the police, instead of facing the consequences of what had happened, we chose to protect ourselves. The silence in the gymnasium had weight now, pressing down on everyone like judgment itself. Michael could see recognition dawning on familiar faces, the Martinez family realizing why Carlos had gotten that promotion, the O'Briens understanding why their son's tuition had been mysteriously waived, the Kowalskis remembering why their construction company had received so many diocesan contracts over the years. Everyone had been paid. Everyone had been complicit, whether they'd known it or not. "We moved his body," Morrison said, and several parents covered their children's ears too late. "We staged a car accident. We buried the truth so deep we thought God himself couldn't dig it up." Malik removed his mask with deliberate slowness. His face was older than Michael remembered, carved by grief and 14 years of planning. But the eyes were unmistakably Amir's. The same dark intensity, the same intelligence that had made his brother such a compelling advocate for community bridge building. "But God doesn't bury truth," Malik said quietly. "People do, and people like me dig it back up." Morrison met Michael's gaze across the gymnasium floor, across 14 years of shared guilt. "I'm sorry, Michael, but this was always going to end here." The police radios crackled outside, and Michael realized Morrison hadn't come to save anyone. He'd come to watch it all burn. The police radios fell silent, creating a vacuum of sound that made every heartbeat audible. Michael watched Morrison's face in the harsh light, seeing not the mentor who'd guided him through seminary, but a stranger wearing familiar features. The old priest's hands trembled slightly as he pulled a second envelope from his coat pocket, one he hadn't given to the authorities outside. "There's more," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. Malik's eyes sharpened. "What more?" "The accident we staged," Morrison's words caught like hooks in his throat. "It wasn't just moving Amir's body. We had to make it believable. We had to—" He stopped, looking at the children in the crowd. "We had to damage him, to match the story we were going to tell." Michael felt bile rise in his throat. The memory crashed over him like a physical blow. Morrison with the tire iron from his own car, the sickening sound of metal against bone, the way they'd argued about which injuries would look consistent with a vehicle rollover. They'd turned Amir Hassan into a prop in their own salvation story. "You desecrated my brother's body." Malik's voice carried a fury so cold it could freeze blood. "After he was already dead, you mutilated him." Sarah Chen's grandmother suddenly stood up, her aged voice cutting through the gymnasium like broken glass. "I knew. I always knew." The elderly woman's Mandarin accent thickened with emotion. "My Harold, he wouldn't stop asking questions. Said the boy's injuries didn't match the police report. Said the timing was wrong." Michael's world tilted further sideways. Harold Chen had been a retired detective, one of the few Chinese-American cops of his generation in Detroit. He'd examined Amir's accident scene with professional eyes and found it wanting. Then Harold had his heart attack, Mrs. Chen continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Right after Father Michael visited our house. Right after we got that check from the diocese for Harold's medical bills. Her voice rose to nearly a shriek. You killed my husband with stress, with knowing. The families were fracturing before Michael's eyes, parents pulling children closer, creating distance between themselves and the priests they'd trusted. The Kowalski boy, little Tommy, who'd served as Michael's altar boy for 3 years, was staring at him with confusion that would soon crystallize into hate. Morrison opened his second envelope with shaking hands. I kept Harold Chen's real report, the one he wrote before his heart attack, the one that proved Amir Hassan died hours before the accident scene was discovered. No, Michael whispered. He'd thought Chen's questions had died with him. Another lie, another miscalculation in 14 years of covering truth with fresh earth. Harold Chen died knowing his government had failed Amir Hassan. Morrison continued relentlessly. Died knowing the police had accepted our story without proper investigation. Died knowing he was the only one who cared enough to dig deeper. Malik's composure finally cracked. You let an innocent man die from the weight of your secrets. We let everyone die from them, Morrison said. Harold Chen, Amir's parents, did you know his mother never recovered? She blamed herself for letting him go to that meeting alone. She died in 2018 thinking she'd failed to protect her son. The gymnasium's heating system cycled off, leaving only the sound of muffled sobbing and the distant hum of police radios outside. Michael realized that Morrison wasn't just confessing, he was performing last rites over everything they'd built. Every family in this room would leave changed, contaminated by proximity to their sins. The scholarship fund, Mrs. Martinez said suddenly, her voice hollow with understanding. The one that's paid for 6 kids to go to Catholic Central over the years. That's Amir's money, isn't it? That's blood money you've been giving our children. Morrison nodded. The diocese paid us to disappear the evidence. We used that money to create the Hassan Memorial Scholarship. A bitter laugh. We named it after him. As if that made it better. As if charity could wash the blood off. Michael watched recognition spread like plague through the crowd. Every family here had been touched by their guilt money in some way. Scholarships, medical bill assistance, job referrals, emergency loans. The entire community had been built on Amir Hassan's unmarked grave. 14 years, Malik said, his voice breaking. 14 years of watching you play saint while my brother rotted in unmarked earth. Not unmarked, Morrison whispered. We buried him in Woodlawn Cemetery. Section J, Plot 247. Under the name John Doe, but we kept records. He pulled a final piece of paper from the envelope, a hand-drawn map with careful notations. I visit him every Christmas. The only prayer I have left. The gymnasium doors burst open as tactical teams flooded in, but nobody moved. The real violence had already been done, not with bullets or explosives, but with words that could never be taken back. Michael looked at the faces around him and saw his life's work crumbling. Every child he'd taught, every family he'd helped, every moment of grace he'd tried to create, all of it poisoned now by the truth Morrison had finally spoken. The worst part wasn't that they'd be arrested. The worst part was that they deserved it. The tactical teams froze in the doorway as if sensing they'd entered a confessional rather than a crime scene. Michael watched the lead officer's eyes sweep the gymnasium, taking in the weapons lying unused on the floor, the hostages who weren't cowering, the strange tableau of 2 priests and a masked man standing over scattered documents like mourners at a grave. Nobody move, the officer shouted, but his voice carried confusion. This wasn't the active shooter scenario they'd trained for. Morrison raised his hand slowly, the map to Amir's grave still clutched in his fingers. Officer, I'm Father Gerald Morrison. I called this in. These men aren't terrorists. They're the family of a boy we murdered 14 years ago. The words hit the tactical team like a physical blow. Michael saw weapons lower slightly as trained professionals tried to process what they'd just heard. A priest, confessing to murder, calling armed hostage-takers family. Jesus Christ, one of the younger officers whispered. and Michael almost laughed at the bitter irony. But Malik was staring at Morrison with an expression Michael had never seen before. Not anger, not satisfaction, but something that looked almost like pity. "You still don't understand," Malik said quietly. "Even now. Even after everything." Morrison blinked, his confession dying on his lips. "What?" Amir didn't come to the rectory that night for interfaith outreach. Malik's voice carried a terrible gentleness, as if he were explaining death to a child. He came because he'd figured out what Father Michael had been doing to the altar boys. The world stopped. Michael's vision tunneled as the lie he'd been living, the lie he'd killed for, shattered like glass. Amir Hassan hadn't been a random victim of circumstance. He'd been coming to expose Michael's abuse of children, coming to protect other boys from what he'd discovered. "No," Michael breathed. "That's not," he never said, "because you didn't give him the chance." Malik pulled out a phone, scrolled to a voice message, and hit play. Amir's voice filled the gymnasium. Young, nervous but determined. "Malik, I'm going to confront Father Torino tonight. I have photos, testimony from 3 boys. If something happens to me, take this to the police. The bastard won't hurt anyone else." The message was time-stamped October 15th, 2009, 6:47 p.m. 37 minutes before Amir had died in Michael's rectory. Morrison's face went white as bone. You told me it was an accident, that he'd fallen." "Because I believed it myself." Michael's voice cracked like a whip across the gymnasium. "I convinced myself I was protecting the church, protecting you, protecting—" He stopped, the full weight of his self-deception crushing down on him. "Christ, I've been lying to myself for 14 years. The families were backing away now, understanding spreading like spilled blood across their faces. Not just that they'd been complicit in covering up a murder, but what kind of murder it had been. Several parents were frantically checking their phones, probably searching for their sons who'd served as Michael's altar boys over the years. Mrs. Chen's granddaughter suddenly spoke up, her voice tiny but clear. "Tommy Kowalski told me Father Michael used to make him stay after Mass. Said it was special priest training, but Tommy always cried after." The words dropped into silence like stones into deep water. Tommy Kowalski was 17 now, a senior, but he'd been Michael's altar boy from age 8 to 12, the same age range as the other boys Amir had been trying to protect. Michael saw Morrison's face crumble as the old priest realized what he'd helped cover up. Not an accident, not even a simple murder. They'd killed a hero to protect a predator, then spent 14 years building monuments to their own guilt, while Michael continued abusing children under cover of sainthood. "How many?" Morrison whispered. "Michael, how many boys?" But Michael couldn't answer. The question was too large, too terrible. He thought of every boy who'd served at his altar, every student who'd stayed after school for extra help, every family who'd trusted him with their children's spiritual development. Malik lowered his weapon completely. 23 boys over 14 years, he said quietly. "We've been in contact with all of them. That's why this had to be public, so everyone would know what they'd been protecting." The tactical officers were calling for detectives now, child services, federal agents. The gymnasium was about to become the center of the largest abuse investigation in Detroit Catholic history. But Michael barely heard the radio chatter over the sound of his own lies finally dying. Morrison dropped the map to Amir's grave, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "I helped a child molester bury his victim. I spent 4 years in the desert praying for forgiveness for the wrong sin." Malik nodded with infinite sadness. "My brother died trying to save children, and you made sure he failed." The gymnasium felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in with the weight of exposed truth. Michael watched Morrison collapse onto the nearest bleacher, the old priest's legs finally giving out under the burden of what he'd learned. 14 years of penance in the Arizona desert, and he'd been atoning for protecting a hero's killer rather than covering up an accident. "The scholarship recipients," Morrison whispered, his voice hollow. "Tommy Kowalski got one. Danny Chen, the Morrison boy, no relation, different family entirely. We've been paying the victims with blood money." Malik's remaining men had removed their masks now, revealing faces that carried the same grief-carved features as their leader, brothers in loss, if not by blood. Michael recognized one of them, Ahmed Hassan, Amir's cousin, who'd questioned the accident report in 2010 before suddenly dropping his inquiry and moving to Chicago. "We tried the legal way first," Ahmed said quietly, his weapon hanging loose at his side. 14 years of trying. Police wouldn't reopen the case. Diocese lawyers buried our requests. The families of the victims were too scared or too paid off to talk. Mrs. Martinez stood suddenly, her daughter's hand clutched in hers like an anchor. "The therapy sessions," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The ones the diocese paid for after Carlos started having nightmares. They weren't trauma counseling. They were keeping him quiet." Michael felt the careful architecture of his lies collapsing room by room. Every kindness he'd shown, every gesture of pastoral care, every moment when families had thanked him for his understanding and discretion, all of it had been designed to protect his access to their children. The lead tactical officer was speaking into his radio, his voice tight with professional strain. "We need Child Protective Services, FBI Crimes Against Children Unit, and someone from the DA's office who handles RICO cases. This is bigger than a hostage situation." Morrison looked up from the bleacher, his face aged a decade in the past hour. "Michael, the boys we sponsored for Camp Sanctification, the summer retreats at the lake house." His voice broke completely. "Tell me you didn't, not there too." But Michael's silence was answer enough. Camp Sanctification had been his masterpiece, a week-long spiritual intensive for promising young Catholics, held at an isolated retreat center where he served as sole chaplain. 50 boys over 7 years, ages 12 to 14, all carefully selected for their vulnerability and their families' desperation for financial assistance. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Morrison breathed, using the invocation that had once brought Michael comfort. Now it sounded like a curse. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the mother, not the daughter, was frantically scrolling through her phone. "I'm calling every family on the altar server roster," she announced. "Every parent has a right to know what they're dealing with." "They already know," Malik said softly. "Some part of them has always known. That's why this had to be public, to give them permission to stop pretending." Michael watched the dominoes of his carefully constructed community falling in real time. Parents making phone calls, children asking questions they'd been afraid to voice, families remembering moments that had felt wrong but been explained away by respect for clerical authority. The gymnasium doors opened again, this time admitting FBI agents whose body language suggested they'd been briefed on what they'd find. No drawn weapons, no aggressive positioning, just the weary professionalism of people who'd worked too many cases like this. "Father Torino," the lead agent said, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd heard every possible denial. "I'm Special Agent Rodriguez. We need to talk." Morrison struggled to his feet, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. "Agent, I want to make a full confession. Everything. The murder, the cover-up, the money trail, all of it." He turned to Michael with eyes that held no forgiveness. "And I can provide documentation going back to 2009. Michael felt his knees buckle as the final reality crashed over him. Morrison hadn't just kept Harold Chen's real accident report. He'd kept everything. Financial records, correspondence, meeting notes, 14 years of meticulous documentation that would unravel not just their crimes but the entire diocesan power structure that had enabled them. "The bishop knew," Michael whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "That's why you ran to Arizona. Not guilt, fear. You knew Bishop Gallagher was going to make you the scapegoat." Morrison nodded grimly. "The church protects itself first, always, but I won't protect it anymore." He looked at Malik with something approaching respect. "Your brother was braver than any of us, braver than 2 grown priests who chose their own skins over justice." The families were streaming toward the exits now, parents clutching children who would never again see the world with the same innocent trust. But some stayed, the Chens, the Kowalskis, the Martinezes, families whose boys had served Michael's altar and whose silence he'd purchased with charity and false concern. They stayed to watch him fall. Michael closed his eyes and felt 14 years of carefully maintained lies finally release their grip on his throat. When he opened them again, Agent Rodriguez was waiting with handcuffs that gleamed like salvation under the gymnasium lights. Before you do that, Michael said quietly, his voice carrying a steadiness that surprised everyone, including himself. Agent Rodriguez paused, handcuffs halfway extended, as Michael stepped forward into the center of the gymnasium, where the weight of 14 years finally demanded its due. The tactical officers tensed, but Michael raised his hands, not in surrender, but in the gesture he'd made countless times at the altar, calling his congregation to witness. For the first time since Amir Hassan had walked into his rectory, Michael Torino was about to tell the complete truth. "My name is Father Michael Anthony Torino," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the gymnasium with the practiced projection of thousands of homilies. "I am 58 years old. I have served as principal of St. Catherine's Academy for 15 years, and on October 15, 2009, I murdered Amir Hassan to prevent him from exposing my sexual abuse of children." The words fell into absolute silence. Even the radio chatter from outside seemed to pause, as if the entire world had stopped to witness this confession. Morrison was weeping openly now, his hands pressed to his face like a child trying to hide from monsters. But Michael felt no tears, only the strange, terrible relief of finally speaking words that had been clawing at his throat for 14 years. "Amir came to my rectory that evening with evidence," Michael continued. "Photos he'd taken of inappropriate contact, testimony from boys I'd groomed and abused. He was 17 years old, and he had more courage than 2 ordained priests combined." Mrs. Chen's granddaughter was recording on her phone now, and Michael was grateful. Let it be preserved, let it spread, let the world know what their trust had protected. When he confronted me, I didn't deny it. I begged him to keep quiet, offered him money, threatened him with lawsuits, promised I would stop. Michael's voice never wavered. But Amir Hassan was a better man at 17 than I have ever been at any age. He told me those boys deserve justice. He told me he would not let me hurt anyone else. Agent Rodriguez had lowered the handcuffs, her professional mask slipping to reveal something almost like respect for Michael's unflinching confession. "So I killed him," Michael said simply. "I struck him with a brass candlestick, one that had been blessed for the altar, consecrated for the service of God. The irony wasn't lost on me then, and it isn't now. I used a holy object to murder a saint." Malik had gone very still, his weapon forgotten at his side. This wasn't the cowering denial he'd expected. This was something else entirely, a man finally accepting the full weight of his damnation. "Father Morrison," Michael turned to his former mentor, "you came to check on me that night because you'd heard rumors about my relationship with the altar boys. You were investigating, weren't you? Trying to protect the children without causing scandal." Morrison nodded miserably. "I'd gotten calls from 3 families, subtle inquiries, careful questions. I should have acted sooner. But you found me with Amir's body instead," Michael continued. "And I lied to you. I said he'd fallen, that it was an accident, that he'd been trying to blackmail me over some minor financial irregularity. You believed me because you wanted to believe me, because the alternative was too terrible." The gymnasium's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize every line of guilt and grief on the faces around them. Michael thought of all the times he'd stood in this same space for school assemblies, graduation ceremonies, Christmas pageants, moments of joy he'd stolen from these families through his presence. "We staged the accident scene together," Michael said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Moved his body to the church steps, arranged the fall, called 911, and then we spent 14 years building monuments to our guilt while I continued abusing children under the protection of that lie." Tommy Kowalski's mother had arrived at some point, summoned by the emergency calls. She stood in the doorway now, her face a mask of maternal fury that made the armed men in the room seem gentle by comparison. Michael met her eyes directly. "Mrs. Kowalski, your son Tommy served at my altar from age 8 to 12. I violated him repeatedly during that time. The special training sessions, the private conferences, the overnight retreats, all of it was structured abuse disguised as spiritual mentorship." The woman's scream echoed off the gymnasium walls like a prayer for vengeance. Michael turned back to Agent Rodriguez, his hands extended for the handcuffs that would end his masquerade forever. "Amir Hassan died trying to save your son, Mrs. Kowalski, and 22 others. He died because he believed children deserved protection more than institutions deserved preservation. As the medal closed around his wrists, Michael felt the strangest sensation. Not peace, exactly, but completion. The lie that had consumed his life was finally dead, and in its death, Amir Hassan's truth could finally live. The clicking of the handcuffs seemed to echo forever in the gymnasium's silence, a sound that marked not just Michael's arrest, but the end of a 14-year performance that had consumed everyone in its radius. Agent Rodriguez's grip was firm but not rough, the professional touch of someone who understood she was handling not just a criminal, but the keystone whose removal would bring down an entire structure of institutional protection. "Thank you," Malik said quietly, and Michael realized the words were meant for him. Not forgiveness, there could never be that, but acknowledgement that truth, however late, however costly, still mattered. Morrison remained on the bleacher, his desert-weathered hands covering his face. 14 years of penance in Arizona, 4 years of believing he'd helped cover up an accident rather than the murder of a hero. The scholarship fund, the Hassan Memorial Garden, the annual interfaith service, all of it had been built on the wrong foundation, good intentions twisted into monuments to their shared lie. "Father Morrison," Agent Rodriguez said, producing a second pair of handcuffs, "you're under arrest as an accessory after the fact to murder and conspiracy to obstruct justice." The old priest nodded without looking up. "The documentation you need is in my hotel room. Safety deposit box keys, financial records, correspondence with Bishop Gallagher's office. 14 years of evidence." His voice was hollow, scraped clean. "I kept it all. Insurance," I told myself. Really, it was guilt. Mrs. Kowalski pushed past the tactical officers, her rage giving her strength that moved grown men aside like paper. 22 boys, she said, her voice deadly quiet. 22 families who trusted you with their children's souls. Michael met her eyes without flinching. Tommy was 8 when it started. He asked me once if what we did was confession because it felt like something he should be sorry for. The words cut through the gymnasium air like shards of glass. I told him it was a special sacrament, that God loved brave boys who kept sacred secrets. The woman's hand moved faster than anyone could stop, the crack of her palm against his face sharp as a gunshot. Michael didn't duck, didn't try to avoid it. The sting felt like the first honest sensation he'd experienced in years. "Ma'am," Agent Rodriguez said gently, "please step back." But Mrs. Kowalski was already retreating, her fury spent, leaving only the terrible exhaustion of a mother who'd failed to protect her child from the person she'd trusted most to guide him. The gymnasium was emptying now, families fleeing to their cars and their phones in their desperate attempts to process what their children might need to heal from. But some stayed. Ahmed Hassan, Malik's cousin, standing near the doorway with tears cutting tracks down his face. The Chen family clustered together like survivors of a shipwreck. The Kowalskis, holding each other with the desperate grip of people whose world had just shifted beneath their feet. "The boys who are men now," Dr. Martinez said suddenly, her voice breaking. "They'll have to relive all of this. The trials, the testimony, the questions. You've stolen their childhoods twice." Michael nodded slowly. She was right. The criminal proceedings would force his victims to revisit their trauma in courtrooms and depositions, to have their pain dissected by defense lawyers and recorded by court reporters. Justice would demand they sacrifice their privacy on the altar of truth. Malik holstered his weapon with the careful movements of someone laying down a burden he'd carried too long. "My brother's grave is in Woodlawn Cemetery," he said to Morrison. "Section 12, under the oak tree. The headstone just says, 'Beloved Son.' We never put hero on it because we didn't know." He paused. "Maybe now we will." Agent Rodriguez was speaking into her radio, coordinating with child services and federal prosecutors, beginning the machinery of justice that would consume the next several years. Michael listened to the procedural language, RICO investigations, victim interviews, diocesan asset freezes, and felt oddly disconnected from it all, as if they were discussing someone else's crimes. As they led him toward the gymnasium doors, Michael caught sight of the St. Catherine's banner hanging above the basketball hoop. Truth, justice, compassion. Words he'd walked beneath thousands of times. Words that had decorated his hypocrisy like flowers on a grave. The October air outside was crisp with autumn's promise of winter, and Michael breathed it deeply as they guided him toward the waiting federal vehicle. The last time he'd tasted air as a free man, before becoming what he'd always been but finally admitted, a predator in priest's clothing, a wolf who'd shepherded the flock into his own jaws. Behind them, the school stood empty and dark, its windows reflecting nothing but the harsh glare of police lights. Tomorrow there would be reporters, protesters, families demanding answers the building couldn't give. Tonight, there was only silence, and the strange piece of a 14-year lie finally buried beside the boy who died trying to end it.